Hi, I'm Butch Vig. I am a producer, musician, and songwriter. This is Billy Bush. He is an engineer who I work with on other projects and also our primary engineer in Garbage and also our main production head when we go on tour.
I've worked with Neon Trees, The Naked and Famous, The Boxer Rebellion, Foster the People, Garbage, of course.
I was working on a new Garbage demo a couple nights ago, and I recorded an acoustic piano, a little upright at my house, and it's not the greatest sounding piano, but I put the Red 51 on it, and it just really opened it up, and put a little bit of the Renaissance compressor on it too, just to put down the initial attack and bring up some of the sustain. And all of a sudden, it's kind of almost sounds like a baby grand, you know, whereas it's not a great piano, but it really came to life. And I also recorded a couple cello parts that interact with each other, and they were done with a soft synth, and it sounded okay. And as soon as I put the Red 51 on that and went in and tinkered with I think I pulled up one of the presets and then I further tweaked it out, and it really put this delicious air on top of the mix, and you can almost hear the bow going across the instruments, and it made them sound real, you know, which is, I guess that's a real plus thing, you know, to be able to get a soft synth and all of a sudden make it kind of come to life like that.
I love the sound of an analog desk. So the sound of when you're working in a studio with a band, and you're recording a whole band, and you hear it come back through a desk, it informs the sound in a way that you can't do any other way. The Red desks have always been one of those things which I would love to get my hands on and try, because it's like a mythical beast. So to have the ability to try not one, not two, but 3 different versions of the Red desk is really kind of a fun and creative thing. To kind of hear how each one distorts a little differently, what the headroom's like, how the EQ sounds, and how overall it colors the sound of whatever you put it on. I've found I really like the way the Red plugin makes things that are in the box, inherently in the box, sound real, like strings. So if you're working on a track and you've programmed some strings and they sound good, you've used really good string library or you've used a really good sample, it still sort of sounds kind of a little bit flat, a little bit one-dimensional. Now, one thing I like about the Red plugin is like you can add some grit to it, you can add some air to it, and it sort of becomes a little bigger and bolder than what it was just coming out of the box. It works great for synths, works great for sort of graining up drum loops and drums and that sort of thing. I find that it's really, again, it makes it a little bit more real sounding, a less sort of plasticky and in the box and digital sounding. RS-56 does an amazing job of making a really musical EQ accessible to everybody. Because that's the thing about a lot of EQs, the frequency selection isn't necessarily a very musical one, it's a mathematical one. So, you know, when you turn up, 512 cycles, it's 512 cycles, but it may not necessarily be what you need. It's close to it, but it's not exactly where. Where on the curve bender, you could tell like every frequency and how the frequency is boosted or cut was done in a really musical way. Like people listened to it and changed it and made sure that when you tweaked it, the result was musical. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm turning up a frequency for, because I can. One thing I find really unique about it is the ability to do mid-side processing with it, which again, if you're dealing with a bunch of synth pads, they're all very wide. I love how you can sort of EQ just the outside edges of it. Really focus the middle and tighten the middle up, but have the outside, all the airy bits, like be really wide and, push the stereo image out. I find that a really fascinating way of approaching EQing something versus just like, oh, I'm going to turn the top end up, or I'm going to turn the bottom up and cut the mids out. It's like instead of just making a smiley face EQ out of something, you can do very interesting things. Like I said, like 50 cycles, get the kick drum to really kind of pop in the center, and then add some 10K sort of air to the very outside of it, and all of a sudden you have this sound that is a lot more real and a lot more like it would be if you were in a room with it. It doesn't just sound like it's a flat sort of like, here's a sound that was recorded in a computer from something that was created in a computer. One plugin that I'm really particularly excited about that you guys have done is the modeling of the Studer J37. Again, it's another mythical beast. Only a handful of people probably alive have ever used it. And again, we're all looking for the same thing, the realism, that three-dimensional sort of result that you get from using analog gear. And the version that you guys have done for that particular machine, it's unique. It's a different slant. It really captures something and does something to the sound, which I think is really unique to all the other tape plugins that are out there. And you've also really created a plugin that's got some interesting tools to it, like the way you've integrated the delay into it, the way you've captured the noise, saturation that the machine inherently has is really unique and useful. And also how you've made it so you can control the wow and the flutter and use it in a creative way as opposed to just sort of like, oh, okay, I want to make this sound like it was done on an old sort of janky tape. It's like you can really do stuff to it that makes it, you can create sounds that you haven't heard before. So it's not only an accurate representation of a great machine, but it's also a really creative tool if you want to think of it above and beyond just the fact that, oh, this is a tape machine that was at Abbey Road that the Beatles used, You don't have to think of it that term. You can just think of it as like, this is a very cool, creative, useful tool to add to your arsenal.
There's something inherent about the sound of tape that really helps glue performances together. There's something about that X factor that is very desirable. And the new plugin sounds so good because it's got, it emulates that vintage sound from the 60s. I never got to go to Abbey Road. I've never been there. I've walked in the street across the famous Beatles cover. But so to be able to use that now, mixes and to put that on individual tracks is really cool because it really does sound amazing. It sounds vibey. And what I really like is some of the effects you can do, like using the wow and flutter to, say, for instance, run an acoustic guitar in it and start to wow and flutter it so it gets sort of almost a natural double course effect. And some of those you can kind of hear that what the Beatles did in some of their recordings, but as Billy was saying earlier, you can really push the envelope with the new plugin and really capture some really cool and interesting effects. And I think to use it as a tool in the studio as that and not just as a tape playback system, to try and capture the sound of tape, I think that's where it really shines, that you can really push the parameters of it and come up with some really unique sounds.
One thing I really like about it is that, when you guys modeled the different tracks, you chose 2 and 3, and you have the option of, if you want to put it on a stereo track, have it be just track 2 on both sides, or track 3 on both sides, or track 2 and track 3. And there's, an obvious non-linear result when you use 2 and 3, like you would with any tape machine. They don't play back exactly the same. And I like the fact that you modeled 2 different tracks, and you can run a stereo thing through it, and all of a sudden you get this sort of wider image, because they're not exactly the same. They're coming back slightly different, EQ slightly different. There's subtle things that happen that make it sound more real, like it would be if it was coming off a tape. And I love that you went to the detail of making sure that was the case.
Well, I have been obsessively looking for an authentic sounding ADT for years. Billy will know this. I mean, even going back to early days at Smart, I used to use a Eventide harmonizer and delay it about 20 milliseconds and pitch it up 10 cents or down 10 cents. And I used it on Shirley, Kurt Cobain, and Billy Corgan. I mean, I've always tried to find something that could sort of get that analog sound. When I first got the Real ADT, I was kind of floored by how analog it sounded, and immediately, to my ears, sounded much like the ADT that the Beatles used.
The thing I found really interesting about the Waves Real ADT plugin is that for the first time, I really feel like somebody has nailed that sort of Abbey Road era, doubled, flanged, or phased sort of sound. One perfect example is, the guitar solo on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. It's like Clapton's solo on that has got that sort of sound. So when you listen to it, that's the sound of the 2 tape machines moving sort of out of sync and the delay happening and moving around. And when you hear it, it's like that sound because it's like, oh, that's what I've been missing for, all this time. And the only people that were able to do it were them. I think aside from the obvious, it does that sort of retro sound really, really well, I think people will find other uses for it that will be equally interesting. It's just one of those things that
you haven't really been able to duplicate to this point very easily, or very, honestly. So for me, it's like the first time where you put something in and you go, oh, okay, that's exactly kind of what, we would come up with these convoluted ways of trying to make it sound like that. And at the end of the day, it's like, it sounded cool, but it didn't have that sort of real analog warmth. And I think that, as people start figuring out some of the interesting little things in there, I think people will start using it in more, unique and more sort of creative ways than just sort of slapping it on and going, wow, it sounds like John Lennon,
We have a tendency to experiment a lot in Garbage, and I then tried putting it on Steve's guitar, and I put it on acoustic guitar. I put it on cymbals on the drum overheads on a drum kit. I ran the bass through it. It's kind of one of those things that if you mess with, sounds good on a lot of instruments, and I don't think should just be looked at to use specifically on vocals, because it sounds pretty amazing on everything. People want an analog sounding tape ADT. The real ADT is going to give them that.